Okay. Alright. Velkommen til et nyt webinar i DMN. Mit navn er Bent Lindhardt. Den her gang har jeg inviteret en gæst fra Canada, Peter Liljedahl, professor Peter Liljedahl, som har lavet en interessant forskning i et arbejde, han kalder The Thinking Classroom. I've just welcomed you, Peter,
yeah.
And Peter will now have around 30 minutes, something like that. And afterwards, we will do as we used to do, have a conversation about the presentation. So welcome, Peter, and you can start the slides now.
Thank you, Ben. Okay, so building thinking classrooms. I'm going to take you through a bit of a journey, tell a bit of a story of where this came from, what motivated it, what some of the results are, and what some of the implications are. So for me, this story began almost 20 years ago. I'm a former high school math teacher. I spent time as a teacher. But in 2003, I was out of the classroom. I was working on my PhD, doing a doctorate in math education. And I kind of built an opportunity for myself to visit classrooms. And I call it an opportunity because as a teacher, you're so consumed with the act of teaching that it's really hard to pay attention to students. And when we do pay attention to students, we only see the part that students want us to see. And I really wanted to understand what students' lived experience is, what the students are experiencing in a mathematics classroom. So I reached out to a network of friends and I asked them to recommend to me good teachers. Teachers that they had heard were good. And then I contacted those teachers and I introduced myself and I said, I'd like to come and spend some time in your classroom. So-and-so says you're a good teacher. And when you send an email like that, they usually say yes, and they did. And then when I was in those classrooms, I would ask them to make recommendations and so on and so forth. And because I was following this thread of good teacher, I got to see a lot of diversity. I was in kindergarten classrooms all the way up to grade 12. I was in low socioeconomic settings, high socioeconomic settings, private schools, public schools, inner city schools, urban schools, rural schools. I saw a lot of diversity. And I was able to visit 40 different classrooms in 40 different schools. And despite all this diversity, everywhere I went, I saw the same thing. Every single lesson I went into, I saw students not thinking. Now, at first, I didn't really notice this. I was paying attention to too many other things. And then I started to get this sense that what I'm seeing is that students are not thinking. And at first, it was just a sense. But I turned that into a research question. I spent a lot of time in classrooms trying to answer the question, are students thinking? And if they're not, what is it that they're doing? And this research produced what I come to call my baseline data. And it revealed that in a typical lesson, some students are thinking. About 20% of students are thinking. But they're only thinking for about 20% of the time. Which means that if I'm observing a 1-hour lesson, 5 or 6 students will think for 8 to 12 minutes. The rest of the students are doing no thinking. At least not the kind of thinking we know students need to do in order to continue to be successful in mathematics. What are they doing instead? They're mimicking. So what is mimicking? Mimicking is where the teacher shows them how to do it and the students just copy it. And this is a problem. And why is it a problem? Because mimicking is so effective in the short term. If a student mimics, they will be successful now. They might even be successful tonight. They might be successful on the quiz tomorrow. But mimicking actually runs out at some point. Mimicking as a learning strategy stops being effective eventually as the students get older. And the things that they learn through mimicking fades very quickly because they haven't actually learned it. And the reason for this is that they're not thinking. Thinking is a necessary precursor to learning. If students are not thinking, they're not learning. And mimicking is not thinking. Mimicking is not learning. This is a problem. The other thing I noticed when I visited these classrooms, and this is going to seem incongruous with what I just said, is that I saw very good teachers. I asked to be referred to good teachers. I saw good teachers. These were hardworking, dedicated professionals. They knew their content. They knew their kids. They cared that the kids learned the content. Nobody was falling through the cracks. But when I interviewed these teachers, they all said the same thing. This is not why I became a teacher. I became a teacher because I want students to understand. I want them to have passion. I want them to see connections. And what I feel like I'm doing instead is it feels like I'm just show and tell. I feel like I'm cutting content into small bite-sized pieces and feeding it to the students. This is not why I became a teacher. The other thing I noticed as I visited these classrooms was that classrooms look more alike than they look different. Sure, there's differences, but there are so many similarities. I've been in classrooms on 6 different continents, and it doesn't matter if I'm in Sweden or Chile or Australia or Taiwan. Everywhere I go, classrooms look alike. And in the 40 classrooms I visited, it happened multiple times that I would walk into a room and I would say, hold on, I've been in this room. I want to be in different classrooms. I'd look through my digital photos. Yeah, there it is. Look at my logbook. No, different school, different town. Like, classrooms look so much alike. And what happens in classrooms looks so much alike. Right? There was this set of practices I kept seeing over and over and over again. There was the lecture, the Q&A, question and answer, maybe some demonstration by a student. But every single lesson I observed ended with students doing individual seat work. Every one of those 40 lessons ended exactly the same. And what this means is that, or what's interesting about this is that the fact that classrooms look alike and what happens in classrooms looks alike has been true for a very long time. Public education has existed for about 150 years, since the end of the first industrial revolution. And when it was formed, it laid down a set of practices that are still with us today. I do. We do. You do. This is what teaching has always looked like. This is what it looks like. No wonder students are mimicking, because everything we do as teachers is laid out to create an I do, we do, you do situation. What has changed in education in the last 150 years? So yeah, I visited these 40 classrooms 20 years ago, but 20 days ago, I was in a school and I walked down the hallway and 18 out of the 20 classrooms I looked in on were all teaching exactly the same way. I do, we do, you do. The students were sitting there mimicking, not thinking. They were disengaged. They were bored. Right? So what this means is that these are not classrooms norms. These are not norms that the teacher has constructed. These are institutional norms. These are normative structures that have permeated the very fabric of school in such a way that we see it everywhere, all over the world. And in many ways, these are non-negotiable, meaning that teachers don't think they have any choice. This is what teaching looks like. This is what teaching has always looked like. This is what teaching always will look like. And I started to realize that if everywhere I go, I see students not thinking, and everywhere I go, I see these institutional norms, these things must be connected. And what that means is, if I want to get students to think, I'm going to have to start breaking these institutional norms. And that became my research project. And for over 15 years, I worked with over 400 teachers, conducting thousands and thousands of micro-experiments. We were trying to renegotiate the non-negotiated norms. Our goal was to break the norms and see if it could have an impact on thinking. We only cared about 2 possible results. Could we get more students thinking? Could we get them thinking for longer? That's all we were trying to do. And we had immediate success. The minute we started breaking these norms, we started to see student thinking. And the more we broke them, the more thinking we saw. Eventually, I reorganized the research into 14 variables. Each of these variables was a response to one of these questions. These are the core classroom practices that every teacher does. Okay, maybe if you're teaching 5-year-olds or 6-year-olds, maybe you're not having them write notes or do homework. But at a certain point, every teacher is using these practices. We all use tasks. We all use collaborative groups. We all answer questions and give homework and have students write notes. We all do assessment, evaluation, report cards. We do these things. And for the most part, they're done with close adherence to these normative practices that I was seeing in the classrooms. And what I was looking for was, is there a way to do each of these practices in such a way that it gets students to think? And not just that it gets them to think, I was looking for the optimal practices for thinking, meaning that I was looking for a practice that any teacher can pick up and have a maximum effect on student thinking. That's what we were looking for. And to be clear, I'm not looking for a practice that a particular teacher can make work. Too much of research and education focuses on a particular teacher. But the problem with that is that so much of a teacher's effectiveness is wrapped up in their personality and their charm and their charisma. I wanted a practice that was devoid of that practice that would work no matter who picked it up. And then that practice would be made more powerful by them adding their personality into it. And before I talk about what these optimal practices are, I just want to say that at no point were the normative practices number one. It would have made my job easier. It would have made it easier if I could point at something that happens in school and say, that's good. Let's just keep doing that. But every time we tested that theory, it showed that the normative practices were ineffective for thinking. And in fact, out of the thousands of experiments we conducted, not only did they never win, not only did the normative practices never come out on top, in almost every instance, they came out last. For some of these variables, we would try 20 things, and the normative practice would be dead last. And to understand why that is, we have to go back to the dawn of public education. When public education was formed, the goals of education were conformity and compliance. That was the purpose of education. And it was inside of the crucible of conformity and compliance that practices like I do, we do, you do were forged. Our goals for education are different now. We talk about 21st century learning skills. We talk about critical and creative thinking. We talk about equity. We talk about entrepreneurship and financial literacy. We have different goals for education now. And there's no way we can achieve today's goal for education using 19th century practices that were born out of a desire to create conformity and compliance. We need new goals. We'll never achieve today's goals using yesterday's practices. And this is why the normative practices never came out on top. So what were these optimal practices? Well, there they are. And today I'm only going to talk about the first three, which is a really good starting point for a teacher to start thinking about building a thinking classroom. So let's start. The first practice. If we want students to think, we need to give them something to think about. And in mathematics, that comes in the form of a problem-solving task. And at first, when I started doing this research, I naively thought that that's all we need. We just need really good tasks. Everything else will take care of itself. And I was dead wrong. Yes, we need really good tasks. They are necessary, but they are far from sufficient, as this list will indicate. A good task is needed, but we need other things as well. But we do need a good task. And we thought that would be hard to find. We thought it would be difficult to find good thinking tasks. Turns out it's not. We are surrounded by good thinking tasks. It's not hard to find interesting word problems, interesting visual problems, interesting counting problems. These tasks are tasks that engage students so innately that they can't help but start to think. And in fact, they don't want to stop thinking. They work all period. And then they come back on Monday and they say, I was thinking about this task over the weekend, and I think we can improve upon our answer. We can't get them to stop thinking. And when we found these tasks, we started to notice some patterns in them. The first pattern is this. Every time we have a good thinking task, we notice it has a low floor, which means that it has some level of approachability for every student. Every student can start. But that doesn't make the task trivial, because the task also has a high ceiling. It has some sort of either evolving complexity or some sort of a way of extending the task so that the students can keep thinking. So it has a low floor. Everyone can start. It has a high ceiling. Everyone will be challenged by it. And the third thing we noticed was that every time we found a good task, a good thinking task, it was always something the students had never seen before. It was brand new. It was novel. And this kind of makes sense, because thinking is what we do when we don't know what to do. If we know what to do, we just do it. So these tasks had to be novel. They had to be something the students had never seen before, because if they know what to do, they just mimic. They just do it. That's called mimicking. They have to think. And the fourth thing we noticed was that all of these great thinking tasks often had nothing to do with the curriculum, which is a problem because we have things to teach. But we wanted to understand, we started to think, can we take these ideas, low floor, high ceiling novelty, and move it into our curriculum? And it turns out we can. Because it turns out that asking a student to figure out which is greater, 3/5 or 4/7, is an amazing thinking task until we show them how to do it. Then it's a mimicking task. Asking students to factor a quadratic is an amazing thinking task until we show them how to do it. Then it's a mimicking task. We are drowning in curricular thinking tasks. The problem is that we suck the thinking out of it. I do, we do, you do, sucks the thinking out of these tasks. If we use these tasks in a thinking classroom way, then we have the ability to have students engage in a thinking way with curriculum. And what's really clear here is this is what we want to be doing. We want our students to spend 95% of their time thinking about curriculum. And there's much more to say about that, but the only thing I do want to say is these types of tasks are still really important. Because our research showed that in order to kickstart the culture of thinking, to get students to start thinking, we need to start with non-curricular tasks. Tasks that students want to engage in, that they feel safe engaging in. Then, once we've built that culture, that's when we shift into curriculum, right? We want to make thinking students that will think about anything we put in front of them, not just these highly engaging non-curricular tasks. All right, so now we've given students something to think about. We have to now give them someone to think with. And that comes in the form of a collaborative group. Now, when we first started doing this research, like much of the work we did in this project, the first thing we would do is study how it's going so far. So we would go into classrooms and we would observe, how are teachers grouping students, and is that working? And we found that teachers group students according to one of two strategies. The first strategy is called strategic grouping. Strategic grouping is where the teacher very carefully makes the groups. They design the groups to meet some goal that they have. Maybe they want to create homogeneous groups so that they can do differentiation. Maybe they want heterogeneous groups so the stronger students can help the weaker students. Maybe they want peace and quiet, so they have to keep certain students apart. Maybe they want to reward the students, so they'll put friends together. Whatever the goal is, the teacher very carefully orchestrates the groups. This is called strategic grouping. It's the dominant grouping strategy we see for elementary teachers. We see some of it at high school, but we see it predominantly at elementary. The second grouping strategy is where the teacher says, work with who you want. So this is called self-selected groupings. And this is a dominant strategy we see at secondary school. What was interesting about this is that both of these groupings were ineffective for getting students to think. And ironically, for exactly the same reason. We surveyed hundreds of students. And hundreds of students who were either in strategic groupings or self-selected groupings. And we asked them a simple question. If you knew you were going to work in groups today to solve a problem, what is the likelihood that you would offer an idea? And 80% of students said that they were either unlikely or highly unlikely to offer an idea. And when we pushed on that, what they revealed is that that's not my job. My role is not to be the leader. My role is not to be the thinker. It doesn't matter if you're in strategic groups or self-selected groups. Students know what their role will be. And for 80% of the students, the role is to follow, not to lead, not to think. So how do we disrupt this? Random groups. Random groups takes the power of decision away from the student and away from the teacher. And it's not good enough to be random. It has to be visibly random. That is that the students have to see that it's random. Otherwise, they think we're just being strategic. And it has to be frequent. For the first hour, the roles are really dynamic. There's a lot of role exchanges within the groups. Leaders become followers and writers. It's just constantly changing. After that first hour, the students settle into a set pattern of behavior, and they found their roles, and they just stay there. And we're back to where we were before. So it has to be frequent, about once every hour or every class. So frequent, visibly random groups. 3 weeks in, the same survey. What is the likelihood that you would offer an idea? 100% of students say that they would offer an idea. Despite the fact that 50% of them say, it probably won't lead to the solution, but I'm going to offer an idea. Everybody sees themselves as being able to contribute. This is massive. We learned some other things as we went. We learned, for example, that the optimal group size was 3. We didn't know why, but within 2 months, we knew that group sizes of 3 were optimal. It took us 2 years to understand why that is. And it has to do with the fact that we want to make sure that groups have enough redundancy and diversity. So redundancy is what every member of a group brings together that's the same. Common language, common notation, common vocabulary, common knowledge. They have to have some things in common in order to be able to talk to each other. But if all they have is redundancy, then the group is no stronger than the individuals. It also has to have diversity. That diversity is what every member of the group brings to the group that's different. And what happens is if the groups get too big, although we get lots of diversity, we get less redundancy. Groups of 3 have this perfect balance between redundancy and diversity. We also learned through that and other things that diversity is a strength. Diverse groups always outperformed homogeneous groups. Because when you do random groups, you will get some groups that are diverse and some groups that are homogeneous. You can't help it. Randomness will create that. And sometimes randomness will actually put your 3 strongest students together. And when that happens, a teacher goes, pay attention to that group. That group is going to kick butt. That's my best students. And every time a teacher said that, the group over there outperformed them. The group of seemingly weaker, more diverse students outperformed the high-achieving homogeneous groups. Diversity is a strength. They hold each other responsible in different ways. They ask better questions of each other. They bring so much different ideas to the table that the students are able to figure out the problems in so many better ways. We learned some other things. For example, when I said groups of 3 is optimal, that's true for students who are 8 years old and above. Under 8 years old, we found that groups of 2 were optimal, at least to begin with. Students don't naturally come to school able to collaborate. At best, they play in parallel. Maybe they do some polite turn-taking where they're able to reshare a resource, but they don't actually collaborate. And it's not until we can get students collaborating in a great group of 2 that we want to move into groups of 3. There were other things that emerged when we started doing random groups. The first thing is this. Every single teacher who ever did visibly random groups frequently comes back after 3 weeks and says, I have never had a community like I have now in my classroom. The students have just coalesced into this amazing community of learners. And when that happens, it unlocks empathy. The students start to care about each other. And that's when real collaboration can start. Real collaboration doesn't happen when the student only cares about themselves. It's not until they start to care about the other members of their group that collaboration can really take off. And good collaboration is vital for the rest of the thinking classroom practices to work. All right, so now we've given the students something to think about. We've given them someone to think with. We now have to give them somewhere to do that thinking. And our research showed that the optimal workspace for students to work in their random groups of 3 was on what we call a vertical non-permanent surface, or what we could call a whiteboard. Having those groups of 3 stand up and work on whiteboards. And it doesn't have to be a whiteboard. It just has to be vertical and it has to be erasable. So a blackboard works. A window works. The side of a file cabinet works. Cellophane that you wrap flowers in, taped up on the wall, works. It doesn't matter as long as it's vertical and erasable. Why? Why erasable? Because it turns out that risk is a tremendous barrier to thinking. When students feel at risk, they don't want to think. They don't want to take the risk. When they feel safe to risk, they're more likely to think. And when they're working on a surface that's erasable, they feel that they can risk more because they can just erase their mistakes. And we see this in the data. When students are working on non-permanent surfaces, like whiteboards and blackboards, versus permanent surfaces, like big pieces of paper, they risk sooner, longer, and more. And we can see this in the data from the time to first notation. When they're working on a whiteboard, they will start writing within 20 seconds. When they're working on paper, 2 minutes it takes before they're willing to write anything. But why vertical? I understand now that it has to be erasable, but why vertical? Can't I just have whiteboards on the table? There's a whole bunch of reasons why vertical was better, but definitely it was better. One is that when it's vertical, we can see each other's work, which means that when we get stuck, we can look around the room and get ideas from other groups. It means that we're standing side by side. We're looking each other in the eye. We're all looking at the work the same way. But more than any of these things, the thing that made the biggest difference, and it took almost 2 years to learn this, is that it has nothing to do with standing and everything to do with sitting. Because it turns out that when students are sitting, they feel anonymous. And when students feel anonymous, they disengage. And that's both a conscious and a subconscious act. And students who sit further from the teacher feel more anonymous and are therefore more likely to disengage. What standing did was it took away their anonymity. They didn't feel anonymous anymore. They didn't disengage. And this was a game changer. And in fact, when we enact the first 3 practices, and this is what the research has shown, that if a teacher is to start building a thinking classroom, to enact all 3 of these practices at once. After that, they can activate practices one at a time. But these first 3 together transform the classroom in fundamental and profound ways. Remember that my baseline data was that 20% of students spend 20% of their time thinking. If you enact just these 3 practices, we're seeing 80% of students thinking for 80% of the time. It's a huge improvement. So there it is. Those were the first 3 of 14 practices, and it's important to keep in mind that there are more practices, including 3 practices that are entirely dedicated to assessment. And if you want more information about this, there is a book. And this book is laid out the way these practices are laid out. If you're interested in vertical non-permanent surfaces, that's practice number 3, chapter number 3. You want to know more about random groups? Chapter 2. If you want to know more about assessment, that's chapter 12, 13, and 14. And and this book is coming out in Danish in September, they're estimating now. And there's a supplement to the book. And in the supplement, we talk about how to modify these practices if we have to teach in an online environment, and so on and so forth. And when we put all of these practices together, what we start to see is a fundamentally different classroom. What we start to notice is that we see deep collaboration among students in groups. Even in very difficult situations where the students are squished together, you still see deep engagement and collaboration within these groups of 3. But more than that, you see collaboration between the groups. As they start to talk, the boundaries between the groups dissolve and the groups of 3 start to interact with each other. If you look at this photograph, it would be very difficult to spot where the groups of 3 are. They are still sort of have a home base with this group of 3, but they're borrowing ideas and sharing ideas across these boundaries that allows the entire class to learn. You start to see enthusiasm as students are running from one group to another with their ideas. You start to see courage emerge as students take a lead and are willing to talk to the whole class about their ideas. You start to see pride as students become proud of the mathematics they do. And even in instances where students have an opportunity to work on their own, they cluster together in a phenomena that we call alone together. They're working on their own together so that they can, at the drop of a hat, access the knowledge of the people around them if they need it. And when we put it all together, this is what a thinking classroom looks like. It's a fast, busy place. This is sped up. This is not how we teach in Canada. The person in the middle of the room is an observer from Spain. She is not the teacher. The teacher is the tall guy in the black t-shirt. And if you pay close attention to this video, you start to notice tremendous interaction within a group, between groups, and that these students are not working on some fun, non-curricular task. They are working on straight-up curriculum. And if you pay close attention to the clock, you notice that that was an 85-minute lesson. And if you look at the thinking and engagement in this room, you will notice that 90% of these students spent 100% of their time thinking, whereas 10% of students spent only about 50% of their time thinking. So this is how we start. We start with the 3 practices, and then we start to transform our practice. And we're not just transforming our practice, we're fundamentally transforming the experiences of learners as mathematicians, and it changes who they are, it changes their relationship with mathematics, it changes their belief in themselves, their identity, and it changes their futures. So that's it for now. Thank you very much. There are some places where you can get more resources if you're interested. Twitter, #ThinkingClassroom, has got teachers posting every day about what they're doing in their classrooms from around the world. The Building Thinking Classrooms Facebook group has almost 19,000 teachers every day talking about how they're building their classroom and the things that they're seeing. There is a website, and if you're interested in the PowerPoint, there's a bit.ly there, or the QR code will take you there as well. So that's
Thank you very much, Peter. And we will have a short pause for 1 and 2 minutes, and we'll be back and have a discussion about the slides Peter just have showed us. Thank you for now. Skal vi gå i gang?
Yeah.
We go. I tæller ned igen.
Oh, we get one of those now.
Welcome back. Now I will have a dialogue with Peter about his speech, his talk, and we will get around several questions. I can mention that the book Thinking Classroom have today, after 1.5 years, sold 60,000 books. So I think a lot of teaching have been interesting in what Peter just have told us. Let's start, Peter.
Sure.
And thank you for your presentation. I know you have 14 points at your list, and maybe you could give us a view about if it's in a priority order or it's just placed in another way.
So, so of course, this is a really important question, and we started to realize that ourselves. The research was being done in pockets here and there. We were trying to emerge the optimal practices. And then we eventually had all 14 practices. But no teacher can enact all 14 at once. It's just not possible for a teacher. And even if they could, the students would be overwhelmed by that amount of change. So we have to start somewhere. And that became our next question. We asked ourselves where to start. So I spent 2 years doing research on just that part, where I would deliver workshops for teachers. So 20 teachers would come, and I would teach them only about 3 practices, and they would go away and implement. Another 20 would come, and they would learn about some different practices and be told different orders to implement. And all the feedback and all the data that was coming back eventually revealed that there was an order.
Okay.
That the most important place to start, and the data very clearly said that the place to start is with a thinking task, non-curricular thinking task to start with, random groups, and vertical surfaces. Okay. Those are the 3 practices that I shared today. But the data also showed that those practices need to come together. And this is what constitutes what we call the first toolkit.
The 3 first have to go together.
They have to go together. Now, of course, they don't have to. If a teacher decides that they're going to just take everything they normally do and put it on whiteboards, you will see an improvement. If you decide you're going to start doing random groups, you will see an improvement. But what we found was that we saw a huge improvement if you do those first 3 at once. And in hindsight, those 3 practices, although the teacher has to change things about themselves, have nothing to do with the teacher. What those 3 practices are about is changing students, creating an environment that doesn't allow for mimicking to happen, requires thinking to happen, so that the students will change, so that they will become thinking individuals. And this is one of the mistakes that we make so often in education, is that we ask teachers to make a change, but we don't ask students to make a change. So if a teacher makes a change and the students don't make a change, it's very hard for the teacher to sustain that change. Those first 3 practices require the teacher to make a change, but what it's all about is getting the students to make a change. Once they have changed as learners, the teacher can take the next step. And the next step, they now enter into the second toolkit. And the second toolkit is made up of the next 5 practices in this list. Those practices are all about the teacher. It's about how do we answer questions? How do we do homework? How do we arrange the furniture in our room? How do we give tasks? When do we give tasks? How do we start to foster autonomy in the classroom so that we let go a bit more? And how do we get the students to take on more responsibility? That toolkit is all about the teacher, and it requires some courageous changes and teachers to think about some things. But each one of those makes an important contribution to thinking classrooms. Here, they only have to implement 1 practice at a time. And the book is laid out in such a way that the teacher can start reading in chapter 1. And it actually says in the book, don't do anything yet. Read the first 3 chapters. Now do something.
Okay.
And then after that, you read chapter 4, enact chapter 4. Read chapter 5, enact chapter 5. And the order reveals itself. In chapter 15, I show what the 4 toolkits are. But a teacher can start very easily, but start with those first 3 practices.
Okay. Then you answered my next question, because where do the teachers start with if you want to do something?
Yeah.
But okay, maybe we could, if you want to do something tomorrow, what should you recommend the teacher to do?
Well, what I recommend them to do is find a really good task, and you can go to my website, you can go to the Facebook group, you can ask you will have a good task for them to do, and the resources that you have. They just need a task that requires students to think. Put them into random groups, that's easy to do. And get them standing up, working on a window, or go to the flower store on your way home from work and buy some of those sheets of cellophane and tape them up.
Yeah.
And then you're ready to go. You're ready to go. And then you will see your students be different. And when you see your students be different, that's when it starts to become important to you. Yeah.
What was the most scary for a teacher to change?
So this is one of these most fastest, easiest type questions. I can say that the easiest practice to implement is random groups. Yeah. The scariest practice to implement is random groups.
Okay.
The hardest, like the one that really you have to work really a long time as a teacher to do well, is how we consolidate a lesson. But that doesn't happen until practice number 10.
Okay.
But random groups is frightening for teachers, and I understand why. We so carefully want to ensure that a good day happens. A good day for us, a good day for the students. We want to make sure that the students feel safe and that there's good social cohesion within these groups. Yeah. We so much want to do that we control who they work with. And controlling who they work with is one of the ways that we sort of set the destiny of the day. And going to random groups can be very frightening because it's the ultimate release of control. Yeah. Because those two students who are so problematic when they're together, they might end up together.
Yeah, we know.
Yeah. And they will. They always do on day one. It happens every time.
But Peter, there will be, I think especially in Denmark, be teachers who are concerned about the social dimension in the classroom. Do we collaborate as a class, just not only as a group? Has your advice for it? Because do you think every math lesson should be with random groups? So
there's never an always or never type of situation here. Because some teachers will come into class one day and say, okay, you know what? We've been working on the whiteboards a lot. It's time for us to do some check your understanding questions. This is how we've transformed homework. And you can work on your own. And I showed a picture of students doing that. But if you're going to make groups, our research shows that random groups is best. And what's really interesting about our research is that it shows that when teachers implement random groups, they do so for about 6 weeks. And then a percentage of teachers stop doing random groups. Okay. And then after a week, they're doing them again. And
why?
There's a couple of reasons. One is you think you start to see this culture emerge, this community emerge, and you think you're safe, that now the community is there. So I don't have to do random groups. The students say, can we work with our friends? And then you say, okay. And then you notice that it's not as effective. So then you go back to random groups. Okay. But the more interesting one, and this happens 80% of the time, if teachers do random groups for quite a while, and then they don't do it, the students ask for it.
They like it.
They like it. And it's not the students who you would think like it. Of course, there's students. The student who is shy loves random groups because they now don't have to ask to join a group. It just happens.
But the last one who are going to be chosen.
Or they have to approach a group and then they say no, and then it's a child who is shy they die a little bit every day. That you say getting yourself into groups. But even the groups who have a lot of the students who have a lot of social capital, the ones who are popular, there's so much pressure on them around being with their friends. It just is so refreshing that I don't have to think about this. I don't have to worry that your feelings are going to be hurt if I'm working with so and so. It takes all of the pressure off.
But Peter, we have also earlier discussed the children who have problems with math, who have learning difficulties, and we got children who have math anxiety. We have children who cognitive have great problems or big problems about handling the math. Couldn't it be a problem to be in a publishing way, standing where everyone can see what they are doing, and they have to do something where they maybe are shy and a little bit passive in the classroom? Have you noticed something about that?
Okay, so there's a whole bunch of things I need to say about that. So first of all, teachers anticipate these problems much more so than the students actually live them.
Okay.
The students actually talk about feeling safe in their group of 3 because the work that's on the board is not their work individually, it's their
It's
work.
a group's
It's
work.
a group's work.
Okay. Yeah.
And that so they feel safe by and large. Now that's not always true. Sometimes, so one of the things that happens is when we go from a traditional setting to a thinking classroom setting, we've changed the game. And the game reveals things among different students. So for example, you have the student who has ADHD. They're very hyper. They need to be busy.
We know.
This student struggles sitting in a desk all class. You put them in a thinking classroom,
You loved it.
they love it. Now you have a student who is shy or anxious. Maybe they have a diagnosed anxiety order or an undiagnosed anxiety order. This is a student who sits in the 3rd desk from the front in the 2nd row. You don't even know that this student is anxious in a traditional setting. But all of a sudden you put them in a thinking classroom and they become a little guarded. So we have to work with that student to find their courage and help them integrate.
Have you seen a resistance among these children in the beginning? Maybe
Resistance is a wrong word. Hesitance
Okay.
is a better word. It's not that they're fighting you.
No.
They're just a
Okay.
little hesitant.
Yes, okay.
But we have a strategy for dealing with that. And it works really well, like 100% success rate. And that is that when we have a student who is anxious, what we say to them is, and we may not know they're anxious until we put them in a thinking classroom.
No.
We notice it. We say, okay, I'll tell you what. Here's the deal. I want you to stand 3 meters behind your group for 5 minutes and just listen. And then come and tell me what you hear. And then when they come and tell you, you go, oh, that's so interesting. I wonder what's going to happen next. Can you go back and listen and come and tell me a bit?
Yeah.
So we create a safe role for them. And then the next day, 2 meters, 8 minutes. Right? The next day it's 1 meter, 10 minutes.
We get closer.
And then eventually, and it happens always within about 5 or 7 days,
Okay.
there's what we call a perfect storm. There'll be that moment where the student knows what's going on. They feel safe with the group that they're with. And then they will say something. And it happens every time.
Okay.
They say something. And then after they've said something, within a day or 2, they're holding the marker and they're writing. And the bubble has burst and they're fine. Anxious students want to be, they want to be included. They just, there's just so many barriers for them to get over that. And we have a 100% success rate with that one. Maybe I can tell a story that sort of encapsulates this. So I was working with a school where I was working with the teachers and the educational assistants. These are the helping teachers who are in the classroom to work with students who either have low ability or who have some sort of a cognitive diagnosis. In Canada, we call it an IEP, an individual educational plan.
We haven't got it in Denmark. But,
But there's often a school psychologist involved and so on and so forth. So I'd come in and I'd do the first workshop with the teachers. There's 10 teachers and 4 of these educational assistants. And then I leave, and then I get an email from the teacher who is my contact, and she says, the teachers are loving this, they're all doing it. The educational assistants are saying there's no way that this can work for their students. It cannot work. It's too much inconsistency, there's too much chaos, there's too much noise, there's too much risk, there's too much all of this stuff. They don't believe it'll work. And I said, okay, well. And they said, so I said, we came to this agreement that the next time I was back in 2 weeks, I would teach a lesson. I would demonstrate a lesson with all the teachers and the educational assistants watching. And we would pick a class that has several of these students in it so that the educational assistants can see what happens. So I come back and they give me a grade 9 class. So these are students who are 14 years old-ish.
Yeah.
Okay, so probably your grade 8.
Yeah, I know, grade, I think 15.
And so we have a meeting with all the teachers beforehand, and I say to the educational assistants, So tell me about the students in this class that are your students. And they all crossed their arms and they said, nope, we're not going to tell you anything. You got to figure it out on your own. I said, okay, fine. So we go into the class and I do a task. We worked for maybe 45 minutes. And then we left the room. And we had a meeting, all the teachers. And I sat down at a table and I said, okay. And I turned to the 4 educational assistants. I said, there are 5 students in this class who have some sort of special designation. I named all 5. I named their diagnoses and what the special educational plan was for each of them. They were floored that I could, in such a short period of time, identify these students, identified what the conditions were, and what their specified treatment was. Now, here's the irony. Of the 5 students, 4 of them were leading their groups.
Okay.
And in fact, one of them was leading so severely, I had to step in and rescue the 2 other students who were normally A students, top students, who couldn't keep up with his thinking. And I had to slow him down and get these students included. I'm not saying that's going to happen every time, but what I'm saying is that when we think about students with special needs, we tend to think about them in the context of a traditional classroom and how they struggle in that setting. And when we put them in this, things are different. We're changing the game.
We have a lot of discussion about inclusion just now in Denmark, and I know in Canada you told me children who before was in special classes and somehow organized in that way now are in the classroom as they are in the Danish classrooms, and we have a very big discussion just for a few days ago what to do to educate the teacher better and make changes. And now you get the $10,000 question, could thinking classroom be a part of the changes for this inclusion discussion?
Okay, this is not my area of specialty, but we're seeing lots of teachers and lots of school districts are using Thinking Classroom exactly for this purpose. Because it decenters teaching. What it does is it turns teaching from one thing into 100 things.
I know.
It's now students talking to each other, groups talking to each other, the teacher interacting, the differentiation is built in. There's so much support from student. Once the empathy gets unlocked, the students are supporting each other. There's just so many more ways that a student can find a way to belong in this setting than that one way of belonging in a traditional setting.
In Denmark, we are very concerned about IT as a part of the math culture. How do you think it in discussion about Thinking Classroom?
So there's 2 things that I don't talk about in the book, but I don't talk about them for what I say, don't ask a fish about water. They are manipulatives and IT. In my opinion, they should be such a big part of the classroom all the time that we shouldn't even be talking about them. It's like talking about what type of chairs or whether or not we should have windows. Like it should just be there, ubiquitously, constantly present. Students can use it in multiple ways. And in Thinking Classrooms, they do. Some of the best thinking tasks are IT exploration tasks. And some of those are going to have to sit down to do.
Sorry, I interrupt you a bit, but couldn't there be a contradiction when you have the discussion around the laptop and when you're looking at the laptop and you're working at the vertical? Is there some problems around that?
So, first of all, we try to get away from the laptop as much as possible. Mobile devices are better. iPhones, tablets, they're more portable.
You can bring it to the board.
There's a couple of rules that we've found work best around IT. 1 device per group, period. Another thing that works that we found is really impactful when we're using IT, because we want the IT to be there as a resource. So the students have figured out a function. They're not sure if that's the right answer. Let me graph it. GeoGebra, there's the graph. They look at it. Okay, that's not quite right. Let's get back to the thinking. but two rules that really work well with that is whatever's going to go, you have to write on the board what you're going to put into the device. Yeah. And you have to write on the board what comes out of the device. Yeah. So the device is a mediator as opposed to the objective.
This is the precise thinking somehow.
Yeah.
When you have done your homework somehow by the thinking at the board. I got a thought when you look at Singapore and look at Germany. They're thinking about concrete, pictorial, and abstract.
Yeah.
The pictorial part, for me, somehow is the vertical.
Yeah.
Before they're doing the abstract symbolic work.
But the abstract symbolic also happens.
Yeah, also
at the word.
Yeah, of course, yes.
Yes. And in fact, the video I showed, that's what they were doing there.
Yeah. You can refine it in somehow.
Yeah.
Yes. We have to discuss the group of 3 or group of 2.
Yes.
Because I know a lot of teachers around me who have told me, well, why not 2? And you have somehow described it. But couldn't you have a risk for the group to be 2 plus 1? You talk about if you are a 4-person, there can be one who are not a part of the work and just looking and sitting and doing nothing and somehow a little caricated. But isn't there a risk for 2 plus 1? Who wouldn't be there if it's 2?
Of course. So what happens is, the first thing that I want to draw attention to is, way back at the beginning of the presentation, I talked about when I went into classrooms and I said that 20% of students are thinking for 20% of their time. When I interviewed the teachers, that's not what they were seeing. So when I asked the teacher, how did that lesson go? And they're like, oh, that was great. Everyone was totally focused except for those 3 jokers at the back. I'm like, well, here's the data. And they're like, so the fact that students are disengaged or off task is invisible in a traditional classroom. A student can drift away and the teacher will never know. In a vertical space, in a thinking classroom, immediately you see it. So the fact that absolutely you can get a 2 plus 1 where one student starts to drift away. But it's so obvious because what you noticed immediately is they take a step back.
Yeah,
the teacher sees it immediately. And now you can do something about it. And the absolute easiest thing to do, because in a thinking classroom there's only 1 marker per group, because when we had every student have their own marker, they didn't ever actually become a group. 1 marker per group. The easiest thing to do when you see a student stepping back is you just come up and grab the marker and you hand it to that one student and push them towards the board. And if they don't know what to write, that's okay. The group will tell them what to write. And now they're at least involved in the generation of the artifact.
Okay.
But and sometimes we have to work at it different ways. But you'll know. There's absolutely no chance that you would know if a group of 3 sitting in their desks, if one tuned out. You would never know. But you know. Why is it so important? What we found was with groups of 2, which is our second best alternative.
Yeah.
So if you have 29 students, you make groups of 3, and then you have a group of 2. Groups of 2 often run out of ideas very quickly. So sometimes we have to have 2 groups of 2. Whenever we have that, we try to put them close to each other so that they can use each other's ideas. But groups of 2 just run out of ideas. They don't have enough diversity. But there is a caveat. When we work with manipulatives, sometimes we go groups of 2. Sometimes with technology, groups of 2 is better. Sometimes when we have a third object, there's too many hands involved otherwise. But groups of 2 often run out of ideas very quickly.
I would like to go to the beginning of the school where they are in kindergarten or first and second grade. I think some teachers will have the thought we can't use it for very young children, young pupils. I know you have opinion about that. So I would like to hear it.
Data about that.
You have data about it. That's better.
Yes.
Please tell me.
Absolutely, it works, and it actually is easier because if you're starting to work with 15-year-olds who have grown up in a system.
Yeah, you have the tradition in their head.
And what it means to do math and be mathematical. We have to
That's the right way.
move that out before we put the new one in. With kindergarten and young children, they don't have that already. They're ready to go. You tell them to think, they'll think. And there's so much stuff to think about in primary grades.
That's
right? It's not an issue. The funny thing is, they only use the bottom half meter of the board all the way around the room.
That's all right.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we are getting nearer when we have to stop. And I think I would like to ask the last question for you about the possibility for be sure that there are going to be changing at the school. I have followed Paul Cobb in his work and missed the project, and he's very fond about the teamwork belong the teachers at the school. Have you words about using your teamwork to get the changes and not only be the lonely wolf doing it?
Yeah, and the island, I call it.
Okay, could you use your words about that?
So the first thing I can tell you the descriptive results of this. We know that when teachers come with at least one other person, when they want to make change and they have a partner to make that change, they are more likely to sustain it. They're going to grow faster. They're going to feel more courage. And they're going to be able to innovate quicker. But that doesn't mean that if you are by yourself at your school and you want to make this change that you can't. We have seen tons of teachers do that. And I think the fact that we have this Facebook group with almost 19,000 teachers is a testament to this. When teachers want to achieve something, they will find people to talk to. Right? So even if you're by yourself at the school, doesn't mean that you can't make the change. It just means you got to find someone to talk to. If you have that partner, that's even better. But if you are a partnership and you know of someone that's by themselves, reach out to them, include them. Because teachers will grow. I always say that there's nothing that I can say that's as valuable as two teachers talking to each other. If you get teachers talking to each other about their practice, we're going to see tremendous growth.
I think it's a very fine word for the last word for you, Peter. And jeg siger tusind tak, fordi I kiggede med. Og thank you, Peter, for coming from Canada all the long way from the other part of our world. Thank you for this, and we'll be back another time. Bye.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.